Okay, welcome back to Pinocchio. We're going to continue reading. We're on chapter 20. We're moving pretty fast compared to when we were um, reading the book for the five elements of literature. So let's see how far we can get today. All right, chapter 20. Liberated from prison, he starts to return to the fairy's house, but on the road he meets a horrible serpent, and afterwards he's caught in a trap. That is the theme of this chapter. It doesn't have chapter titles, it has a little theme. You can imagine Pinocchio's joy when he found himself free. Without stopping to take breath, he immediately left the town and took the road that led to the fairy's house. On account of the rainy weather, the road had become a marsh into which he sank knee deep. But the puppet would not give in. Tormented by the desire to see again his father and his little sister with blue hair, he ran and leaped like a greyhound. And as he ran, he was splashed with mud from head to foot. And he said to himself as he went along, how many misfortunes have happened to me, and I deserve them, for I am an obstinate, passionate puppet. Obstinate means stubborn. I am always bent upon having my own way, without listening to those who wish me well, and who have 1,000 times more sense than I have. But from this time forth, I am determined to change and to become orderly and obedient. For at last I have seen that disobedient boys come to no good and gain nothing. And will my papa have waited for me? Shall I find him at the fairy's house? Poor man, it is so long since I last saw him. I am dying to embrace him and to cover him with kisses. And will the fairy forgive me for my bad conduct to her? To think of all the kindness and loving care I received from her, to think that if I am now alive, I owe it to her. Would it be possible to find a more ungrateful boy or one with less heart than I have? While he was saying this, he stopped suddenly, frightened to death, and made 4 steps backwards. What had he seen? He had seen an immense serpent stretched across the road. Its skin was green, and it had red eyes, and a pointed tail that was smoking like a chimney. It would be impossible to imagine the puppet's terror. He walked away a safe distance, and sitting down on a heap of stones, he waited until the serpent should have gone about its business and had left the road clear. He waited an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, but the serpent was always there. Even from a distance, he could see that the red light of his fiery eyes and the column of smoke that ascended from the end of his tail. At last, Pinocchio, trying to feel courageous, approached to within a few steps and said to the serpent in a little soft, insinuating voice, excuse me, Sir Serpent, would you be so good as to move a little to one side, just enough to allow me to pass? He might as well have spoken to the wall. Nobody moved. He began again in the same soft voice. You must know, Sir Serpent, I am on my way home where my father is waiting for me, and it is such a long time since I saw him last. Will you therefore allow me to continue my road? He waited for a sign in answer to his request, but there was none. In fact, the serpent, who up to that moment had been sprightly and full of life, became motionless and almost rigid. He shut his eyes and his tail ceased smoking. Can he really be dead? Said Pinocchio, rubbing his hands with delight. And he determined to jump over him and reach the other side of the road. But just as he was going to leap, the serpent raised himself suddenly on end like a spring set in motion, and the puppet, drawing back in his chair, caught his feet and fell to the ground. He fell so awkwardly that his head stuck in the mud and his legs went up in the air. At the sight of the puppet, kicking violently with his head in the mud, the serpent went into convulsions of laughter, and he laughed and laughed and laughed until from the violence of his laughter he broke a blood vessel in his chest and died. At that time he was really dead. Pinocchio then set off running in hopes that he would reach the fairy's house before dark, but before long he began to suffer so dreadfully from hunger that he could not bear it, and he jumped into a field by the wayside, intending to pick some bunches of muscatel grapes. Oh, that he had never done it! He had scarcely reached the vines when, crack! His legs were caught between two cutting iron bars, and he became so giddy with pain that stars of every color danced before his eyes. The poor puppet had been taken in a trap, and there to capture some big polecats who were the scourge of the poultry yards in the neighborhood. So there was two type of cats that were usually there trying to get into the um, chicken hens to eat the chickens, but they were there when he got caught in the trap. Chapter 21. Pinocchio is taken by a peasant who obliges him to fill the place of his watchdog in the poultry yard. Pinocchio, as you can imagine, began to cry and scream, but his tears and groans were useless, for there was not a house to be seen, not a living soul passed down the road, and at last night came, partly from the pain of the trap that cut his legs, and a little from fear at finding himself alone in the dark in the midst of the fields. The puppet was on the point of fainting. Just at that moment he saw a firefly flitting over his head. He called to it and said, "Oh, little firefly, will you have pity on me and liberate me from this torture?" "Poor boy," said the firefly, stopping and looking at him with compassion. "How could your legs have been caught by those sharp irons? I came into the field to pick two bunches of these muscatel grapes, and but were the grapes yours? No. Then who taught you to carry off other people's property? I was hungry. Hunger, my boy, is not a good reason for appropriating what does not belong to us." That is true, said Pinocchio, crying. "I will never do it again." At this moment their conversation was interrupted by a light sound of approaching footsteps. It was the owner of the field coming on tiptoe to see if one of the polecats that ate his chickens during the night had been caught in his trap. His astonishment was great when, having brought out his lantern from under his coat, he perceived that instead of a polecat, a boy had been taken. "Ah, little thief," said the angry peasant, "then it is you who carry off my chickens." "No, it is not I, indeed it is not," cried Pinocchio, sobbing. "I came into the field to take two bunches of grapes. He who steals grapes is quite capable of stealing chickens. Leave it to me. I will give you a lesson that you will not forget in a hurry." Opening the trap, he seized the puppet by the collar and he carried him into his house as if he had been a young lamb. When he reached the yard in front of the house, he threw him roughly on the ground, and putting his foot on his neck, he said to him, "It is late and I want to go to bed. We will settle our accounts tomorrow. In the meanwhile, as the dog who kept the guard at night died today, you shall take his place at once. You shall be my watchdog." And taking a great collar covered with brass knobs, he strapped it tightly round Pinocchio's throat, and that he might not be able to draw his head out of it. A heavy chain attached to the collar was fastened to the wall. "If it should rain tonight," he then said to him, "you can go and lie down in the kennel. The straw that has served as a bed for my poor dog for the last 4 years is still there. If unfortunately robbers should come, remember to keep your ears pricked and to bark." Prick means keep your ears up and listen for any noise, and remember to bark. After giving him this last injunction, the man went into the house, shut the door, and put up the chain. Poor Pinocchio remained lying on the ground, more dead than alive from the effects of cold, hunger, and fear. From time to time he put his hands angrily to the collar that tightened his throat and said, crying, "It serves me right. Decidedly, it serves me right. I was determined to be a vagabond and a good for nothing. I would listen to bad companions, and that is why I always meet with misfortunes." That means that's why bad things always happen to me. If I had been a good little boy, as many are, if I had been willing to learn and to work, if I had remained at home with my poor papa, I should not now be in the midst of this field and obliged to be the watchdog to a peasant's house. Oh, if I could be born again, but now it is too late, and I must have patience. Relieved by this little outburst, which came straight from his heart, he went into the dog kennel and fell asleep. Okay, so far there's no pictures. I haven't shown you pictures because there hasn't been any pictures. Okay, chapter 22. I think we'll stop after that. Pinocchio discovers the robbers and as a reward for his fidelity is set at liberty. He had been sleeping heavily for about 2 hours when toward the midnight he was roused by whispering strange voices that seemed to come from the courtyard. He put the point of his nose out of the kennel and saw four little beasts with dark fur that looked like cats, standing consulting together. But they were not cats. They were polecats, carnivorous little animals. I think earlier I told you they were cats. They're not really cats. They're like weasels. There's the long, skinny animals with a long tail, and they eat little rodents. They eat chickens, and okay, they're carnivorous little animals, especially greedy for eggs and chickens. Oh yeah, they eat eggs and young chickens. One of the polecats, leaving his companions, came to the opening of the kennel and said in a low voice, "Good evening, Melampo." "My name is not Melampo," answered the puppet. "Oh, then who are you?" "I'm Pinocchio." "And what are you doing here?" "I'm acting as a watchdog." "Then where is Melampo? Where is the old dog who lived in this kennel?" "He died this morning." "Is he dead?" "Poor beast, he was no good. But judging you by your face, I should say that you were also a good dog." "I beg your pardon, I'm not a dog." "Not a dog? Then what are you?" "I'm a puppet." "And you are acting as a watchdog?" "That is only too true, as a punishment." "Well, then, I will offer you the same conditions that we made with the deceased Melampo, and I'm sure you will be satisfied with them." "What are these conditions?" "One night every week you are to let us visit this poultry yard as we have hitherto done, and to carry off 8 chickens. Of these chickens, 7 are to be eaten by us, and 1 we will give to you, on the express understanding, however, that you pretend to be asleep, and that it never enters your head to bark or to wake the peasant." "Did Melampo act in this manner?" asked Pinocchio. "Certainly, and we were always on the best terms with him. Sleep quietly, and rest assured that before we go we will leave by the kennel a beautiful chicken ready to be plucked for your breakfast tomorrow. Have we understood each other clearly?" "Only too clearly," answered Pinocchio, and he shook his head and threateningly, as much as to say, "You shall hear of this shortly." The 4 polecats, thinking themselves safe, repaired to the poultyard, which was close to the kennel, and having opened the wooden gate with their teeth and claws, they slipped in one by one. But when they had just passed through, when they heard the gate shut behind them, with great violence, it was Pinocchio who had shut it, and for greater security he put a large stone behind it to keep it closed. He then began to bark, and he barked exactly like a watchdog, bow, wow, wow, wow. Hearing the barking, the peasant jumped out of bed, and taking his gun, he came to the window and asked, "What's the matter?" "There's robbers," answered Pinocchio. "Where are they?" "In the poultry yard." "I shall come down directly." In fact, in less time than it takes to say amen, the peasant came down. He rushed into the poultry yard, caught the polecats, and having put them in a sack, he said to them in a tone of great satisfaction, "At last you have fallen into my hands. I might punish you, but I am not so cruel. I will be content myself, instead of carrying you in the morning to the innkeeper of the neighboring village, who will skin and cook you as hares or rabbits, with a sweet and sour sauce. It is an honor that you don't deserve, but generous people like me don't consider such trifles." He then approached Pinocchio and began to caress him, and among other things, he asked of him, "How did you manage to discover the four thieves?" To think that Melampo, my faithful Melampo, never found out anything. The puppet might then have told the whole story. He might have informed him of the disgraceful conditions that had been made between the dog and the polecats. But he remembered that the dog was dead, and he thought to himself, "What is the good of accusing the dead? The dead are dead, and the best thing to be done is to leave them in peace." When the thieves got into the yard, when the thieves got into the yard, were you asleep or awake? The peasant went on to ask him. "I was asleep," answered Pinocchio, "but the polecats woke me with their chatter, and one of them came to the kennel and said to me, 'If you promise not to bark and not to wake the master, we will make you a present of a fine chicken ready plucked.'" To think that they should have had the audacity to make such a proposal to me! For although I am a puppet, possessing perhaps nearly all the faults in the world, there is one thing that I certainly will never be guilty of, and that of making terms with and sharing in the gains of dishonest people. So he's saying he'll never be dishonest, but isn't that what he's been all this time? "Well," said my boy, cried the peasant, slapping him on the shoulder, "such sentiments do you honor, and as proof of my gratitude I will at once set you at liberty, and you may return home." And he removed the dog's collar. And that is the end of chapter 22. So we will continue with probably, it looks like to me, maybe only 2 chapters next week because they are very long chapters. But we're getting very close to chapter 29 where we left off last year before our lockdown. And then we'll find out what happens in the end of the story. All right, we'll see you next week. Bye-bye.